Hi there. Today we're going to go over how to use the KRC layer. First thing we want to do is add the layer. So we go over here to add new layer. We want to make sure we're on the home category, and we have to scroll down to find the other section, and it's actually near the bottom of the other section called beta KRC layer. Click on it and we can see it added it here to the top of the list. Our 2D hasn't changed, but that's to be expected. So the first thing we want to do in the KRC layer is to add a data point, and we can do that by clicking anywhere on the 2D. Once we select a point, we'll pop up this dialog. It populates with a default name and the lat and longitude of where we clicked. We can edit these values if we want to change them slightly, and if we're okay with them, we say add. So there you can see we now have one KRC point. I'm going to add a couple more just so that we have some more data to work with. And there you go, we have 3 KRC points there. Okay, cool. So now we'll go over to the focus panel, double click on it to open it up. Let's switch over to the data tab, and at the top here you'll see a table that now has 3 entries, one for each of the points we just added to the 2D. I showed you that we could add points by clicking in the 2D view, but we can also add points here by clicking create new data point. It pulls up the same dialog that we used before, except it's not populated with anything. So we can enter a name and an exact latitude and longitude. This could be useful if you're working with very specific points on the surface, and it's easier just to enter them in than to try and click on the exact points. Okay, so next thing we'll take a look at is this section down here, this input section. I don't know if you noticed when I selected one, then it populated the input section. It also highlights the selected point in the 2D for reference. So what we have here, we have a bunch of input values that are editable, and they can affect the output of the thermal model. So by default, the L sub s, the hour, and the opacity are always the same. L sub s is always 100, hour is always 13.5, and opacity is always 0.3. Like I said, these are editable, we can change them. This is just a starting point. These other values, albedo, thermal inertia, slope, azimuth, and elevation, those values are actually drawn from global numeric maps that we have for Mars. If you flip back to the info tab, there's a little bit more information on exactly what maps we're using to pull that data. But what they are is they're basically supposed to be guidelines or a starting point of what is a reasonable value for that point. Again, these are editable also, so if you want to just see what changing them, how that affects the thermal model, we can definitely do that. If you have another data source that you think is more accurate and you want to use those values, you can obviously do that too. Okay, so another important thing to note is that if we do want to change some of these values, we can either edit an existing point or we can create a second point that's a duplicate but just has a couple values different. And that can be useful for comparing different things. So for instance, if we want to look at this point right in the middle, KRC 0.1, and we want to say what's the difference between having an opacity of 0.3 and having an opacity of 0, we can say create new data point from inputs, and that's going to create a duplicate of the KRC first point. So it's at the same exact lat lon, and all the other values right now are the same because we didn't change anything else. The only thing we changed was the opacity. Okay. Another thing we can do is say for this point, maybe we want to look at a different time. So let's go something like the middle of the night. And again, I'm going to say create new data from inputs. I can show you what this other button does. So if we change, let's change the L sub s, or sorry, the opacity again, something like that, we can just say set inputs. So this button doesn't create us a new point, but it sets the values that we just changed onto that point. Okay, so when we have a couple points that we want to work with, we flip over to the results tab, and now you'll see another table here at the top, and all the values are red. And that's because we haven't run KRC yet. So the tooltip says no KRC results exist for this data point with current inputs. So we want to run KRC, and we want to run it for all of them, so we select all of them, and we say run KRC for necessary data points. Now this part is actually talking to our backend, so the time that it takes can vary depending on your data connection and your data speeds. Typically only takes 10 to 15 seconds, so just be patient and hopefully it doesn't take too long for you. Let's see, here we go. There we go. Okay, so we have a plot with data, right? Let's see if I make this a little bit longer just so it's a little easier to see. Okay, here we go. We have 5 different plots here. And as you can see, as I move my mouse, this blue line follows me. And that blue line is an intersection. And it also updates this table that's shown at the bottom. And what we have here is the hour, which is actually the x-axis, and then the temperature, which is the value on the y-axis. So we can compare how these points look, or sorry, how the model output looks for the different points. Each of the points is labeled over here with its name and the corresponding color that you see on the map. So if you remember, we made a duplicate of point 1 and changed the opacity. So selecting any of the rows up here is going to change what's shown in the plot. The plot will only show which rows you have selected. So if I select those 2 that we were looking at, we can see here this 1, 1, that's the one where the opacity is 0, and the first one, that's the default, that's where the opacity is 0.3. You can see the red one with no opacity actually changes the thermal model. It's not a huge difference, but it's definitely noticeable. So that's one thing to look at. And then we also had done the similar thing by changing the time of day. Oops. Let me do this. Okay, and what you'll see here is that the 2 plots are actually identical. And the reason for that is because this plot that we're looking at right now is the surface temperature over a day for a given time of year. Now, the time of year is determined by the L sub s, and both of these points have an L sub s of 100. And they're both at the exact same location, and all the other inputs are exactly the same. So these plots are supposed to be exactly the same. The hour that we changed is actually an input that's used for the second plot. And you see down here there's a day and a year plot. Currently looking at the day, if we switch over to the year plot, what we're seeing here is we're actually seeing the temperature on the surface over the entire year for 1 point time of day. So this blue plot is showing it at hour 13.5 all year long, the middle of the day, and the red plot is showing at hour 2 for the entire day, or sorry, the entire year, and that's the middle of the night. So as we see here, there's quite a large difference in temperature, and that seems to make sense, right? It's colder at night, it's warmer during the day. So that's what changing the hour does. And similarly, if we were to create 2 points at the exact same place and just change the L sub s, we would see a difference on this plot as well. So another quick thing to note is when we have data that we're happy with working with and we want to be able to export it, we have a couple options for doing that. Once we have a plot with all our data in it, we can right click and we can say save as, and that'll save as a PNG, which is just a screenshot of the plot. Or there's a export as CSV, and that one will export all the data in this plot as a comma separated value file, which can be imported into Excel or any other software that you can work with CSVs. So that can be quite useful. You have to do one for the day and one for the year if you were to get all that data. Okay, one last thing that I skimmed over. This section down here that says display options, that has to do with how the point looks in 2D. So if we want to turn the label off, you can see it disappeared. We can turn the point off and just leave the label. These things are mostly just so that you can see it, make it easier to visualize in the 2D. And also if you want to take screenshots or create figures, you can style it how you want so that it looks a little bit better or easier to read. And then also on this info tab, we have some information about what version of KRC is running, what the layer is actually doing. We have some good links for more documentation on KRC and a paper by Hugh Kiefer also. So I highly encourage you to check out this layer. It's sort of a newer functionality, a newer prototype layer that we're hoping that people will find useful. And I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that you learned something. Thank you. Give us some feedback if you have any comments or questions or suggestions. Great. Thank you.